It's been so long since we clapped together, we weren't sure if we still could. Thank you, folk choir. That was absolutely beautiful. It feels kind of redundant to mention another song right now. But I was reminded during this week of preparing for this service of the Harry Belafonte song, Turn the World Around. And he asks, do I know who I am? Do you know who you are? See we one another clearly? Do we know who we are? Among other things, there's lots of lyrics. And these are some of the questions that lie at the heart of Unitarian Universalism. And I would go even further to say at the heart of whatever innate human desire drives us to make meaning and find our place in a larger whole. In short, whatever drives us to find religion. Because that is the driving force for so many of the world's religions. Questions of who we are, why we are here, and how the world works have led us into every shrine and temple and cathedral ever built, seeking answers. But before these questions led us into philosophy and theology, before creed and catechism and sacred writings, they started right here, where we are, with observation and wonder at the world around us. Spirits of fire and air and earth and water and ancestors and harvest and drought and plenty and famine. Around the world and in so many cultures, it was the earth that was our first holy ground. The rocks and trees and animals, the original prophets. Even in my most irreligious moments, and I have had them, I have always been drawn to celebrate the solar cycle. The longest day and the shortest night, those moments where light and dark are poised in a balance on the cusp of another turning. I have said on more than one occasion, probably from this pulpit, that one of the reasons that I'm drawn to celebrate the cycle of the year is that these are holy observations that occur with or without my own observation, whether I believe in them or not. The solstice comes and goes, and the wheel of the year turns. These cycles of nature are the raw materials of humanity's first religion, the Church of the Earth. In the world that we live in today, connecting with nature is a precious commodity. And that connection that was once so intrinsic to human life has to be sought out for most of us if it is to be found at all. Now, I live in Texas, where there are 3 whole seasons between summer and fall. In case you were wondering, it goes summer, Hell's Front Porch, false fall, second summer, which I think is what we're in now, I hope, and then actual fall. And the pool season lasts for 8 months. It's a mixed bag. I love my temperature-controlled environment, is the point. And I live in Houston, the area of Houston, where theoretically I can live in the same city as a friend, but have to drive an hour and a half to see them. So I can't very well live without the freeway system and the automobile. But I am cognizant of what these conveniences have cost me in terms of my connection to the planet. It is so much easier to remember that I am part of all that is, just another animal among my kin when I am climbing a mountain, or floating in a lake, or hiking a path through the woods. I know very few people who do not have some sort of deep heart longing for some landscape, be it rolling ocean, or fog-shrouded mountain, wide prairie, piney woods. What are the lands that you long for? We Unitarian Universalists partake in a living tradition that draws from many sources, including the spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions, which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. For the modern UU, we might take our relationship to the earth as a source of spirituality as a given. We might even take it for granted. It was not always so. It was less than 30 years ago that this source was added to the list of sources that we claim explicitly as part of our living tradition. It was adopted in 1995 at the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly as the sixth source of our living tradition. And this action did not take place without struggle and without controversy, as unusual as that might seem to those growing up in the faith today. The same stereotypes about pagan traditions, witchcraft, Native American traditions, and other earth-centered traditions does affect us because it is part of the dominant cultural narrative that we were talking about earlier in those readings. And perhaps more significantly, we are sensitive to the judgment of others in the world around us whose prejudices lack understanding. UU pagan and NPR reporter Margot Adler likens paganism to a poem or a work of art, since the worshiping of and with the natural world is, as Adler puts it, a religious practice based on myth and metaphor rather than literal understandings. Now, it's hard to just say paganism is, because there are so many earth-centered traditions from the cultures of this world. But most have a few elements in common. One, honoring the rhythms of nature and finding wholeness and balance within them. The seasons each bring lessons and blessings. Spring brings new life and richness and possibility. Summer offers heat and light in abundance and celebration of living. The autumn is a time for harvest and plenty, even as the falling leaves remind us that death is also part of the cycle of life. The winter's wisdom is the wisdom of rest and stillness. Nature is alive and imbued with spiritual energy. This is another common element and part of our understanding of the rhythms of nature. God is not remote. God is right here in the food we eat and in the air we breathe and in our own bodies. There is no spiritual world or secular world. There is just one world. Many earth-centered traditions also are aligned with a concept of the divine feminine, which might explain why later more patriarchal religions found them so very threatening. Scholar Rianne Eisler, author of The Chalice and the Blade, has written extensively on the image of the female in ancient religions. And primary religions, I love that term that she uses, saw a correlation between the body of the earth and the body of a woman. Fertile, nurturing, sustaining, rich. Mother Earth makes sense to many, including many who would never call themselves a pagan. We humans understand that we are inextricably tied to the health and well-being of the planet. You can't talk about earth-centered traditions without recognizing the central role of ritual and practice. And these are embodied expressions of spirituality. In the modern Western world, it's very easy for us to think about religion as something that happens in our hearts, in our souls, in our minds. The more esoteric, non-material parts of what make us us. But with a deep connection to the earth comes a deep connection to the bodies that we navigate along its surface. Rituals of harvest and fertility and connection with the spirits of the earth are intimately tied to the spirituality of the body. These are traditions that are felt not just with the heart, but also with the hands. And lastly, many of these earth-centered traditions put relationship with the earth and each other as having the deepest spiritual significance. Before we put God in the sky, remote and out of reach, we already found God in each other and the world around us, and many of us still do. The interrelatedness of all life is one of the touchstones, I think, that Unitarian Universalism shares most directly with the earth-centered traditions of the world. And we celebrate the resilience of those traditions. Despite millennia of suppression, indigenous expressions of this experiential, ritual, earth-centric religious life continue to be handed down in some cultures, and in some are being reconstructed from historical artifacts and documents and stories handed down through generations. And many Unitarian Universalists have specific practices that have been handed down to them or that they have researched and cultivated. And we'll be hearing about some of those in a couple of weeks when some of the members of Northwoods are invited to take my place up here and share their wisdom. It would be a serious omission on this day before a national holiday commemorating one of the earliest and most famously exploitative colonizers of this land, if I didn't touch a little bit on the question of how we engage in respectful cultural sharing as opposed to appropriating another culture's traditions, particularly for those of us who are, like me, the descendant of those European ancestors. I wish I had a checklist or a set of universal guidelines to help us always know the right thing to do, but I don't. That in and of itself is a sermon-length topic, perhaps a book-length topic, and I'm not the one to write it. I recently read a fascinating blog series, about 4 posts, that included some really great questions to ask and some great ways to frame our relationship and engagement with the religious traditions of other cultures. I will share a link to that in the coming week's newsletter, but it also included a powerful story, which I will share today. Story being the most powerful teacher we have. The author of these posts spent 6 weeks at Standing Rock in support of the water protectors trying to block the Dakota Access Pipeline. And during their time there, they were part of a group called Solidarity. It's a group of educators who were working closely with the Indigenous elders on site at Standing Rock to create an orientation for newcomers that would help them avoid common stumbling over cultural barriers in the hope of causing less harm to the very people everyone had come to support. The author writes, at Standing Rock, there were countless ceremonies and prayers that were open to anyone. Non-Indigenous people were invited to participate, but they were also asked not to take these ceremonies, songs, or sacred practices home and use them, not to take them home and use them in their own spiritual practice, which was hard for a lot of people to understand. So Solidarity had a handout that they would give to people when they first arrived that explained the significance better than I ever could. So with that context, I share what they shared with their newcomers in this orientation. It said, being in this space can be life-altering, especially if you are not grounded in your own spirituality, ritual, healing traditions, ancestors, or connection to the earth. If you feel the pull to take on Indigenous people's spirituality in this moment, know that that has been a central feature of colonialism for non-natives to help themselves to native culture without building necessary relationships, without asking permission, and without supporting the Indigenous communities from which they come. Although it can feel like respect or honor, this dynamic is inseparable from the legacy of colonialism. European settlers came bearing the traumas of lost connection with the land and repression of their own spiritual traditions. And being around Indigenous people who still have those connections can bring out feelings of longing. It's important to face our own historical losses and draw on our own roots, rather than trying to claim another culture. If you feel this pull, we invite you to make space to grieve your own lost connections and heritage and knowledge, and to learn from your own ancestral traditions and find spiritual practices rooted in them. This piece names building relationships, gaining consent, and supporting Indigenous communities as good touchstones for someone who, like me, might seek to delve more deeply into a tradition outside of my own. But what drew me most about this handout and this experience was this idea that exposure to practitioners of earth-centered traditions stirs a longing in those of us whose cultures have lost connection with the land. Those of us who come from a history of repression of Indigenous traditions, repression of nature-based spirituality. And it struck me most strongly because I know that one of the hallmarks of the colonizer mind is that white is the default, and it is the normal way of doing things. It is generic. And all the other things in the world, which is most of the world, are exotic and other. And as a white person, one of the things that I do to change my mind is to remind myself that I too have ancestors, specific ancestors. I too have Indigenous traditions to draw from. I too come from somewhere, even if it has been several generations since we left our native soil. In the grand scheme of human history, that was not too long ago. Starhawk, who was a neo-pagan feminist author, and incidentally, was instrumental in the decision to include earth-centered traditions as one of the sources of our living tradition back in the 90s. Starhawk speaks beautifully of this mystic longing. We are all longing to go home to some place we have never been, a place half remembered and half envisioned we can only catch glimpses of from time to time. Somewhere, there are people to whom we can speak with passion without having the words catch in our throats. Somewhere, a circle of hands will open to receive us. Eyes will light up as we enter. Voices will celebrate with us whenever we come into our own power. Community means strength that joins our strength to do the work that needs to be done. Someplace where we can be free. That describes another community I know of. Anybody else hear some familiarity in that? When I think of spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions, I think of these primary religions, deep-rooted traditions and cultures around the globe. I think particularly of the Celtic Druidic traditions and the vibrant panoply of heroes and gods and goddesses that are an ancestral tradition of mine. But I also think about billions of galaxies and billions of brain cells, and how a map of one looks remarkably like a map of the other. That too is a tradition rooted in the earth, in our bodies. I think of the many women persecuted for their knowledge of healing and herbs and folk remedies. But I also think of what we can learn from studying how trees talk to each other. Google it, it's fascinating. It's one of the things I didn't have time for. I think of the children who were punished for speaking their native languages instead of good Christian English in the Gaeltacht in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. And I wonder if my ancestors endured that kind of humiliation. But I also think of how we are made of stars. I think of standing stones and stone circles, and I think of process theology, which tells us that God and us and everything is always changing, always becoming something new, something more complex and unfolding, just as life on this planet complexifies and unfolds through time. But above all, I think of stories. Do you know who I am? Do I know who you are? Do we know who we are? Religion, at its essence, speaks to our desire to find a story that we can live with, live in, and live beyond, transcending time and material existence. Earth-centered traditions tracing back thousands of years, as well as contemporary studies of deep ecology, biomimetics, and religious naturalism, all offer us a single, compelling story. The world and everything in it is sacred. Let us learn to live within that story.